What's up, Mets fans? Welcome to the 2025 roster prediction show right here on both of our channels and on X. Hopefully, everybody is starting their week off good, unless you're a Mets fan. But we will definitely get into that before we get into our roster predictions. Chris, how you doing, buddy?
I was hoping to come onto this stream with a little bit less of an eventful afternoon that we had and the news that we're going to be talking about here to open up this stream, but we got to talk about it. It's unfortunate. This is the New York Mets at the end of the day, and we've definitely seen something like this happen before, as early as last season with Kodai Senga before the season even started. So, as you said, I'm really excited for this episode and this stream because we're going to be going through our roster predictions and projections. um, this is a fun thing that we did last year, and again, we wanted to do it this year. We're doing it a little bit early before any spring training games actually kick off, but it's the most fun because we're going to be seeing so many internal competitions at multiple positions: the bullpen, second base, the whole 9 yards at this point with this roster. So it's going to be really, really fun. Appreciate you all being here again. Check out all the latest content in, the description of my channel and my stream right now. And I know that you posted a video about Frankie Montas as well. So continue to smash the thumbs up buttons. Again, we appreciate everybody who came on board to both of our channels and these streams during the off season. We're going to do content all season long, so we're not going anywhere. So let's get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, of course, the unfortunate news, right? Yesterday, with the excitement of Juan Soto showing up to spring training, the excitement of Pete Alonso showing up early this morning to spring training, and around lunchtime, we start getting news about Frankie Montas and his injury. It's a high grade right lat strain. If you guys remember, in 2016, Noah Syndergaard had a very similar injury, and he was out for most of the year. I think if it wasn't the entire year, I think he pitched like first month of the season and that was it. So this is an injury that it says 6 to 8 weeks, but with the ramp up and everything like that, and if it heals properly, you could see him late May, early June, and it sucks, right? It's you give him a 2 year deal. What was it, $17 million or whatever it was with that per, and he was the guy that was supposed to be in the middle of this rotation and like probably a number four most likely, and it does suck, right? Because we're trying to do a 6 man rotation here, and it's not easy when somebody goes down. And Chris, give me your thoughts on the Montas injury. I know a lot of us were like, "Holy shit, here we go! We didn't even start a spring training game, and we're already dealing with an injury to a piece of this rotation."
I had really high hopes, and I still do, for Frankie Montas whenever he ends up back in a Mets uniform during the regular season. But like you said, we're 5.5 weeks out from opening day. This is a really bad time for this to happen because now we're talking about 6 to 8 weeks for this high grade strain. And you're right, the ramp up for a guy that is not going to be throwing for the next 6+ weeks is going to be monumental. So we're not going to see him for the first month and a half, uh, you know, at least during the start of the season, and that is a huge blow objectively to this rotation that we've been having back and forth between you and myself, right, Rob, of the state of this rotation. So at this point, I'm a Knicks fan, right? I'm a Knicks fan, and I'm used to seeing injuries. It's next man up mentality, right? That is the mentality that the Mets had last season, whether it was due to injuries or performance, and that's exactly what the Mets are going to have to rely on, and it's unfortunate. So now we shift the focus, talking about whether the Mets are going to backfill Frankie Montas' spot for the first month and a half, 2 months internally. I know that we have some, live chat polls going on, especially over on your stream, talking about who's going to be the last starter now that Frankie Montas is injured and we won't see him for a little bit. Griffin Canning, Paul Blackburn, Tyler McGill. There is a world and a scenario where Tyler McGill definitely was in line to maybe start in AAA, and now the Mets potentially need his services back in this rotation, which is unfortunate because I thought the rotation was in a good spot depth-wise to have Tyler McGill be that AAA depth just in case, like an emergency option. And now we're talking about potentially utilizing him. But even more so at this point, I think given this Montas injury, and like you said, not knowing how this is going to heal and how quickly it's going to heal. We'll see Frankie Montas at some point this season, but how is this injury for him going to heal? How is he going to respond when he starts
Yeah.
throwing again? It never hurts, right? To get more pitching in the doors. And at this point, if the Mets aren't going to make that big move for an ace that we've been talking about on both of our channels over the past few months, and these talks with San Diego, et cetera, and their ridiculous asking price, there is a guy that I did not think was going to find his way back to the Mets. That's still a free agent in this market. He's a lefty, and his name is Jose Quintana. Given the age that Jose Quintana is at, right, 36 going on 37 years old, just about, it would make sense at this point to plug him back into this rotation and being that fill-in option. So I could see the Mets doing that, or David Stearns could just take the chance and kind of flex a little bit and be like, we're okay. I put this rotation in the spot that I wanted it to be, even given injuries, and we're going to rely on the internal route. This is going to be so very interesting to see how David Stearns approaches this, because at this point, you are correct. And I saw your comment in your live chat before we even started. This is the way that he wanted to build the rotation, right? This
Yeah.
is the Stearns method. So at this point, he has to make that conscious decision himself. And we're going to have to see which route he chooses to take going forward here. So not what we wanted to hear by and large. We heard a lot of praise from this Mets front office about Frankie Montas and potentially turning it around in his career. He pitched pretty well in the Brewers uniform in the second half of last season, but this is just brutal to start off the spring training before we even see any spring training action. And so it's tough.
Yeah, I mean, the only good thing that comes out of this is that it's not a week before opening day and they have to scramble to find a starter. At least they know, all right, this is what we need internally or externally. This is what we need. Go out and battle, and you have 6 to 8 weeks. You got about 6, 7 weeks to figure it out, and that's the only good thing about it. But I know people in the comments before we move on are saying, "Oh, Frankie Montas is not that good," but it's not about the quality of the pitcher. It is about a guy who can give you 170 to 180 innings in this rotation. Where are you getting at? That's the issue that you have to look at even before performance, right? He was a guy that was going to give you innings in this rotation, right? We don't know if Tyler Magle could do it because, at times he's been hurt as well, trying to pitch throughout an entire season. Griffin Cannon had his injury concerns and also hasn't been good either. These are guys that haven't pitched that many innings in their career, so you have to worry about that as well. And that's why you might get a guy like Jose Quintana on the outside, and maybe at some point they might look at Dylan Cease. I don't know if they're going to do that, but it is an option. Again, the internal options doesn't make me excited, but it's exactly what we have at the moment. And we just have to wait and see. And we'll know rather quickly because you got 2 spots to fill in this rotation. It was only the 6th spot. Now it's the 4th spot and the 6th spot, depending on where you put your rotation. Where would you put Frankie Montas? So the next thing with the whole Marte situation, where the Mets have been very transparent with Starlin Marte, and this is the thing we talked about last year, Chris, that the Mets have been very brutally honest with their players about playing time, about what they're going to be doing at the deadline, and if telling Marte, listen, we might try to trade you, and there's still a possibility you still might be traded during this time frame during spring training as well. Right now we have you, but we are still trying to trade, shop you around, and it starts to go in my head a little bit that the fact that now that we lost a starter, who knows when Montas will be back. I'm not necessarily happy with Stearns did bring in Griffin Cannon, so gave him almost $5 million. So he clearly has an eye and thinking that he can prove something that he hasn't been with the Angels. We know what Tyler McGill is, but he is a part of this. Is it a possibility where a Marte trade and maybe packaging him with I would say, I know people are talking about Brett Beatty, but somebody a little bit more enticed into a team to bring in a middle of the rotation guy, nobody special, but somebody that's like a Paul Blackburn type, another one of those that you could possibly get that might be making similar money or a little bit more money than Marte, and the Mets can offset that cost from the other team and make a trade like that. I don't see that happening. But what are your thoughts about the Marte trade and how transparent the Mets were with Marte and brutally honest they were?
I've been talking about this Marte situation all season long, especially when you have a Pobo that comes out and preaches roster flexibility. You know, the math of how many outfielders are on this team is not hard to figure out. That's like 6 outfielders right there, along with Starling Marte. And I understand that his role is going to be diminished to a part-time DH. He hits lefties pretty well. But again, you know, relying on a 36-year-old veteran who's had injury concerns for the most part of the last 2 seasons after posting a great initial season with the Mets in 2022, it makes sense completely why they would still want to trade Starling Marte. The contract is not advantageous in terms of the dollar figure that he's making, so they're clearly going to have to pay some of that down, but how much of it, right? How much are they going to have to pay down to get anything of value back in return? And you probably do. You're probably right. You have to go ahead and package Brett Beatty and maybe another prospect as well to even entice teams to think about it at that point, given what he's making. So, you know, I saw one of Pat Ragazzo's articles a couple of days ago talking about this very situation as it pertains to both McNeil and Marte and how the money that they're making is not really advantageous in trade talks for the Mets, and that essentially the Mets do want to offload at least Starling Marte. I'm not quite sure about Jeff McNeil, you know, when we're talking about the second base battle that we're going to see in spring training, but they don't want to pay another team basically to be taking on Marte for free without getting anything in return that's of value. We know those trade talks fell through with the Royals to send Marte over for Hunter Harvey back in the MLB winter meetings. I don't know, man. I think at this point, the Mets would really like to move on. I think everything that we're seeing and all these articles from DeComo, Will Salmon, etc., indicates to us that if there is a team out there that's willing to give up anything, right? Not too much value, like you just said, but anything of value at this point, they would take it to free up that roster spot. I just don't see who is going to do it at this point of Marte's career. And at the end of the day, he's still at least serviceable with the veteran leadership and his ability to hit lefties. But you know me, Rob. I've been talking about this for the last, you know, at least since I started this channel, but definitely the last year. I don't like a platoon DH. I like one guy in the DH spot, and that's it. But unfortunately, as soon as you sign Jesse Winker, you're basically committing to a part-time DH platoon between these two names. So I would be very curious to see what the Mets do with Marte, because even if Marte does get traded in the off chance that he does, you're still going to need essentially a righty DH that's capable of taking some of those reps in you know mid-season away from Jesse Winker. Because as much as I like Jesse Winker, are you confident in him being an everyday DH? I'm not quite sure that I am.
I'm sorry.
I
Yeah.
was gonna
I
say,
was like,
is
what the
that
hell,
my
man?
mic or something?
Well, look. I mean, he can't hit lefties. That's the issue.
Right.
And maybe he can. Maybe if he gets the opportunity. But again, we're not trying to, evaluate these guys here. We're just not. Maybe that leads. If you can get rid of Marte, maybe that leads to an easier spot for Luis Acuna to not only play middle infield from time to time, giving Lindor a day off with his back, and maybe playing a little bit when Jeff McNeil might have to play the outfield, maybe left field to give Nimmo a day off and Acuna could play second. Acuna could be that right-handed bat off the bench as well. Or, as a DH, as start, you can get more at bats. And that's probably the only way I see Acuna actually being a big part of this situation if Marte, because you open up a roster spot, right? You don't need another outfielder on this roster, right? And you can easily make that infield a part of that, equation if you have that roster availability. And I think that's the big thing. The Mets aren't trying to trade Marte because of the money. They want that roster spot available. And again, maybe, I still think they could have done a better job of working the roster a little bit to supplement what they actually want to do. I think they kind of, I don't know if they slowly went about this with trading Marte, but they could have always, and this is the thing, they if it comes to a Dylan Cease trade or something a little bit bigger, that's when you can package Marte in a deal with a couple of more prospects and just get him out of the way. That's the thing that I think they've been trying to probably just try to trade Marte on their own, on his own, and that's very hard to do because even teams that are not very good and have might be something that we might need, like a bullpen arm or a back end rotation arm, even if you pay off the majority, if not all, of Marte's contract. What is the benefit of that team getting him? That's a bad team, right? It's just a stopgap for who they would rather have a prospect come up who is 22 years old and might be a star, and they might just throw him out there. That's the hard part with the Mets. You would have to probably find maybe a team that might be in the mix for a playoff spot that might see value in Marte and saying, well, we get him for free, and maybe they have a surplus of starters and say, all right, we'll give you a back end rotation guy if you pay the majority of Marte's contract. That's the hard part with the Mets. I still believe they're afraid to trade prospects for whatever reason. Again, until David Stearns actually pulls something off that involves top 10, at least one top 10 prospect, if not more, I'm not going to believe that. And the problem with, I think, trading Marte and their problems with trading Marte is the fact that they're not willing to give prospects up. And I know David Stern says he's willing to. I still think that's a bunch of, bull until he actually does it. Right. And, Dominico, and to bring up the other point, with Steve Cohen talking about, they asked him about approving trading prospects, and he says that the front office department has control over that, but said that they all can't play here. And that's a fact. We've talked about this time and time again. The fact is, there's not enough room for all these guys. At some point, you got to pick the players you believe are going to be good players, if not really good players, to help your roster this year or in the future. And the other ones have to be assets to make your team better over this year or the coming years. That's when GMs become great GMs. That's when teams become World Series contenders, possibly World Series champions. When you have to make those decisions, and I'm not saying they're all going to be right decisions, but you have to start doing something like that. You can't bring in Juan Soto. You can't be wasting years of Lindor, Nimmo, Alonso in their prime and not make a move that can make you. I'm not saying crazy much better, but good enough. And we talked about this, Chris. Getting a Dylan Cease, yeah, it might cost an arm and a leg, maybe 3 prospects, possibly 4 in your top 20. But you can get Dylan Cease in here. It can be a 5 to 6 win difference just by bringing him in. I'm not saying that he's a great pitcher. He's top, a complete ace. He has a above 3 ERA, but he has a ton of strikeouts. He is consistently throwing 170 to 180 innings. He's a bulldog. He wins ball games, right? 90 wins to 95 wins can be the matter of a division or not, or possibly might even miss the playoff with 90 wins. That's a strong possibility with a very strong National League. So I think they have to package Marte with a prospect or even a bigger package for somebody that can actually really help you. That's the only way you're going to get rid of Marte and that roster spot. So I don't know what the idea is here, but me thinking that they can't get rid of Marte, I think they've been trying to do it with a solo trade where it's just Marte getting sent somewhere and they get something back in return. But again, there is no incentive for teams that are bad that is going to want Marte.
Yeah, you're gonna have to find a middle of the pack team that is, could use his services on a platoon basis and that values his veteran leadership at this point, right? That has to be a selling point for the New York Mets. A team like the Reds makes sense to me. A team like the Diamondbacks that clearly also want to offload a contract themselves for a guy like Jordan Montgomery would make sense. Although at that point, if you're doing that, I'd rather just bring Jose Quintana back on a 1-year deal anyways, personally speaking, and just leave the DH situation as it is. Because again, if you get rid of Marte, there's really no plausible, like, yes, that's the easiest way to get Luis Angel Acuna at bats consistently, but I don't know. It just gets really tricky at that point. So I completely agree with you. And I've been always in favor of a Dylan Cease trade, right? Like I would love to see that through. Do I, if they're asking for Brandon Sproat, does that make me halt those conversations, yes, absolutely, right?
Sure.
Like that's not happening. I just want to put that out there. But if that's still on the table, if the Mets are somewhere lurking and David Stearns is like, you know what, at this point, maybe desperation kicks in a little bit. I'm not saying the Mets are desperate, but if David Stearns starts worrying a little bit about the outlook of this rotation in the first half, enough to pull, the trigger on a deal like that, yeah, absolutely, 100%. I would love to do it. I just haven't been talking about it as an absolute because I'm not confident in the Mets wanting to do that, whether it's not parting ways with prospects or just also simply valuing the rotation that they've built. David Stearns has seemed very adamant in the way that he's built this rotation. Whether we agree with it or whether we don't, that's a separate conversation. But everything that they've indicated to us as an organization has told us that they like the names that they have. Does Montas going down change that? I'm inclined to believe that they didn't put this rotation together hoping and expecting full health for
Oh,
162 games.
sure,
You know what I mean?
sure,
So at
but
that point, are there
yeah, sorry.
contingency plans set in place? That's
Sure,
that's the only question here.
yeah, that's why you bring in the Griffin cannons. That's why you have a Max Credit that you brought in last year. Like I completely understand that, but I talked about this yesterday on the spring training report yesterday that his actions, David Stearns, is not being lined up with what he's saying. He's saying all the right things. Oh, I like my rotation. I like what we put together here. I like our pitch in depth. Yet he was in on trying to get Garrett Crochet. Obviously, that didn't work out because of the asking price. He's in
Right.
on Dylan Cease. If you're so confident in the rotation and your depth, then why are you going out there and willing to give prospects to bring in a starting pitcher that can be, in the top three of your rotation? That's why I just don't believe what he's saying. Now, I'm not saying that deep down he don't think that things can work out, but to be so saying that he's so confident and he believes in the rotation and the guys he brought in and the depth, yeah, that's all fine and dandy. But you shouldn't be going into your depth of your pitching staff right away before you even start a spring training game. And I know you can't, predict injuries and that happens, but all you need is one more injury and you're very much in trouble.
Yeah,
Like, and
I
you haven't
agree.
even started the season yet. That's the issue. And you already have a Senga coming back from an injury that you're trying to protect, right? Is Griffin Cannon and Tyler McGill going to give you innings? Probably not, right? And that's the other thing, right? Montas might, whatever you might think of him, even in the comments, people are saying, "Oh, he's not very good." It's not just about the quality of the pitcher. It's about how you're going to fill those innings, because there's a pretty good chance that you might not even get 180 innings between McGill and Cannon. Can they stay up? Can they stay healthy? Can they actually pitch decent enough to stay in the rotation? Right? It's February 17th. We're about 5 days away until the first game at in Port St. Lucie, and we already have one rotation arm down. Like, you got to be extremely careful here. If you have one more guy go down, we're talking about Max Kranick. We're talking about Tidwell, maybe even Brandon Sproat. And I know people might get excited about the Tidwell or the Brandon Sproat, but you're throwing them out there when they might not be ready. And they're going to have a
I'm
strict
not
innings limit.
Both of those guys aren't ready. And I see a lot of comments
Yeah,
about Brandon Sproat. Like, you have to remember how quickly Brandon Sproat has come up through
yep,
this organization, and he flew through the ranks of, all the levels that he has been at. And then he got to AAA. And yeah, the stuff is still there and it's always going to be there with Brandon Sproat, but the location of his
yep,
pitches were missing. And that contributed to a very sky high ERA in AAA. And he just didn't look as dominant at
yep,
that level. He's going to make those adjustments with some fine tuning. But again, he already rushed through the system because he was performing lights out. You don't need, and you really shouldn't, you know, rush a guy to make the opening day rotation, even with all the hype surrounding him in spring training, for the sake of desperation at that point.
right,
At that point, if you need a stopgap, go sign Jose Quintana.
right.
You know what I mean? Just go do that if that's the actual end all be all with the contingency plans. But we need to pump the brakes on Blade Tidwell, who also struggled in AAA, excuse me, and also Brandon Sproat. So I see a lot of people. I'm as hype as ever about Brandon
Sure.
Sproat. I think that the stuff is there and he's going to make a contribution to this team in 2025, but it's not going to be on opening day and he's not going to be on the opening day roster. I can guarantee that almost.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the important thing too, right? You don't want to throw these guys to the wolves. And yeah, they might be successful, they might actually be great. But again, you're also talking about your top prospects here that they're not going to overextend in any situation. And we talked about this with Christian Scott last year. That was a
Yep.
big concern, right? Even though he was pitching well, they made sure they took him out with a certain amount of pitches or at a certain inning. There was no ifs or buts. It doesn't matter what the scenario was. He was coming out of the game. What do you think is going to happen with Brandon Sproat or Blade Tilla? It's exactly what's going to happen. And it's hard to win that way. It really is, right? This is not a situation where the Mets went into the season looking at Brandon Sproat a part of this rotation or Tidwell. That wasn't the case. They would have signed Frankie Montas. They would have brought in Griffin Cannon if they believe one of those guys, or both of them could be potentially ready to go in this rotation. You wouldn't have signed those guys and spent $20 million for 1 year for both of those guys. You wouldn't have done that. So the Mets don't believe those guys are ready. Now, could they help us later in the year? Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. But their plan wasn't to bring these guys up and start them in this rotation. And maybe necessity, one more injury might actually, force them to, or make a trade that they're probably not comfortable making. But Stearns put himself in this situation, right? Depth is already going in there. It's already getting worked up. And we'll see where it lands us. And obviously, right now, it's Tyler McGill and Griffin Cannon as you're either, somewhere in the back end of the rotation going forward. And that's if there is no more injuries. Let's hope there is not.
Yeah. And so the last thing that I was going to say is that the Mets have the internal depth to internally fill this rotation. It's just the fact of we don't like the options that are going to be
Yeah,
presented to us. That's
it's
the bottom
quantity
line.
over quality. That's basically what it is,
Correct.
right? At the moment.
Correct.
At the
At the
moment.
moment.
So we'll see about that. All right. So we know Alonso arrived. Not much to talk about, right? People are saying he looks a little bit more jacked. He looks a little bit more built. Well, he better be. He's going for another contract. But he ended his interview with the LFGM. Everybody's like, "Oh, Polar Bear is back." He seems like he has that swag, that confidence a little bit. And listen, we need Pete Alonso to have a really damn good year, regardless if he's going to be here next year or not. We need him big time. Juan Soto talked about how important Alonso was, and what are your thoughts about the Alonso arrival and what Juan Soto and Pete Alonso said in their respected interviews?
I mean, if it was ever a doubt that Pete Alonso was going to be batting behind Juan Soto or not, I mean, that can be put to rest because he's definitely going to be batting behind Juan Soto. Juan Soto basically kind of confirmed that himself and stating that the biggest question mark for him when he was deciding whether to sign with the Mets or not was who was going to be hitting behind him and what the situation was looking like in the contract extension talks between the Mets and Pete Alonso. So there you have it, whether it's 2-3 or 3-4 in terms of Soto and Pete Alonso, that's going to be the back-to-back, at least in a small portion of this lineup between those two guys themselves. And I feel confident in it. And not only do we need Pete Alonso to have a good season, Rob, Pete Alonso needs Pete Alonso to have a good season because, like you just said, he is up for another contract. Should he have a fantastic season, he's going to opt out and he's going to be demanding a whole lot of money, right? He's going to be demanding the years and the AAV. And at that point, the Mets are going to have another tough decision to make whether they keep him at that price or not. They were able to do what they did this season and this offseason by negotiating to the fullest with Pete Alonso because Pete Alonso did that to himself. He went out and had an abysmal time in the regular season. Pete Alonso, he knows exactly his flaws of last season. He's not naive to that, right? Regardless if some Mets fans think that he is or isn't, whatever, he knows exactly what he needs to work on. And if there was ever a doubt he was going to show up in great shape, it shouldn't have been because he knows what's at stake here. And the fact of the matter is that one, he never lied to Mets fans stating that he wanted to be in Queens for the foreseeable future. He made that happen, right? He had the option from what we know to leave to Toronto and he didn't want to do it. He said he wanted to stay in Queens, right? But he's also taking a huge gamble on himself as well. He maybe could have gotten an extra year out of Toronto and gotten that flexibility. He actually turned down a potential third year at the New York Mets to take the 2-year deal. He is betting on himself, and this is exactly what I wanted out of Pete Alonso. I wanted him to take that gamble. I wanted him to tell all of us, you know what? I still believe in myself, and I'm going to do it. Even though I didn't do it in 2024, I'm going to shut everybody up. Pete, shut us up. Let's do it.
All
Let's
right.
do the damn thing. And let's make this middle of the order a scary sight for opposing pitchers all season long.
Yeah, it's put up a shut up time for Pete Alonso, and the clock is ticking for Vladimir Guerrero's extension, by the way, just to bring that up. Uh, look, it's put up shut up time for Pete Alonso. We all know that. And there's no better time than betting on yourself for a second year in a row and having a really good season. And, you got one. There's no excuses anymore for Pete Alonso. He has protection. He has guys in our lineup around him. There's no more excuses anymore. So if he fails, it's completely on him, even though there's a lot to blame on him last year, as he was one of the key guys in the middle of this order. He has helped this year. So there's no more excuses. All right, guys. So the time we've been waiting for is the roster predictions for 2025. This is a very early roster predictions before we start a game in spring training. Obviously, we did these rosters predictions right prior to Montas getting injured, but we didn't. We were like, you know what? Let's not fix it. Let's not change his name and put somewhere else. We're gonna talk through it, each of our roster predictions. So, Chris, I'm gonna put your roster up, and then you take it away, and I'll sit in the background and enjoy your predictions. Here you go. Oh, sorry,
All right.
wrong one.
Yeah.
Here we go.
I don't want to be on here for too long talking about the X's and O's, but this is exactly what I have right here. If you missed the video where I had this graphic up, check it out. It's on my channel. 2025 New York Mets opening day roster projections. Clearly Frankie Montas is not going to be on the opening day roster. So we need to either internally fill in that spot. David Stearns does, not we, because we didn't make this rotation. He did. Or they need to go out there and sign a free agent or trade. Clearly, I think that's a little bit of a less likelier route. But let's just go down two routes here, right? The Mets go internal at this point, and I think that if they do go internal, you can see a situation where potentially, listen, this is what I'll say. With Griffin Canning taking one of the last bullpen spots, I think he's going to be that long man. The Mets did not give him a major league contract, $4.25 million to put him down in AAA, right? Or just DFA him. They didn't do that. So I think that he's going to at least be given a chance to crack this roster. I think it's going to be in the bullpen as a long man. I think that if we internally fill the rotation spot of Montas, it's going to be Tyler McGill. I think that we've seen Tyler McGill. They at least have some comfortability with Tyler McGill, and I think that that is the most likeliest of routes. Does that inspire confidence out of me, Rob? I see you laughing right there on this screen. It doesn't inspire confidence from anybody, right? I think Tyler McGill has good stuff, but we've seen over a large sample size at this point that he really hasn't put it together consistently enough. If I had to make the most realistic prediction, one, the most realistic that I think David Stearns can actually still do is going out to get a Jose Quintana, a guy that was a bulldog for this rotation when a lot of people, including myself, wrote him off early in the season. And he was one of the best. He was actually the best Mets pitcher down the stretch of September going into the playoffs. That seems like the most likeliest of routes. It won't be an expensive addition, and it'll be for 1 year. So you don't have to commit long term to anybody, and you don't have to give up the prospect capital. If I had to choose my preference, I'm going with Dylan Cease. Make the trade with San Diego possible and bring in the top line starter and just commit to it. This is the best Mets lineup that I'm going to say it that I have probably seen maybe in my lifetime, maybe, right? It's up there, especially with Juan Soto being added into the middle. Look at this top five, ladies and gentlemen. If we get a bounce back season. I'm not even asking for 280, 290, 300 from Brandon Nimmo. 275, 18 to 20 home runs. You know what I mean? Bring in close to 100 RBIs, maybe 90 like he did last season. That's perfect for a 5-hole hitter behind Pete Alonso. You got Mark Vientos there in year 2 in the 2-hole. That is my lineup on an everyday basis. I've already made my case as to why I prefer Mark Vientos in the 2 spot over Juan Soto. I think it gives the Mets the best chance to win, and it gives Mark Vientos the best pitches to hit, which takes away the ability for him to have a sophomore slump. But any way that you create this lineup, whether it's Juan Soto batting second and Mark Vientos batting third, or Mark Vientos batting fourth and Pete Alonso batting third behind Juan Soto, like we just said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We can have conversations about that, and I'm sure that it will change on a semi-regular basis, depending on performances and personnel. But this lineup, the personnel in this lineup that Mendoza has to work with is a beautiful sight. So that's why I am making the strong statement and basically giving my case to David Stearns. Go get that top line starter. You did a great job hand in hand with Steve Cohen to build this beautiful lineup. Commit to the starting rotation, and we'll worry about that contract extension for Dylan Cease when it gets here at that point. We've got championship caliber aspirations, ladies and gentlemen. We do. And the bullpen also mimics that. Those are the two, like, I have no complaints. I'm sure Rob doesn't either about the bullpen or the lineup. There's no complaints out of me. Edwin Diaz all the way down. I don't even care who wins that last bullpen spot. You can give it to Griffin Canning. You can give it to Danny Young. You can give it to Genesis Cabrera, Sean Reed Foley, even Huascar Brazaban, who has some electric stuff. Those top 6 guys from Edwin Diaz down to Jose Buto inspire a lot of confidence out of me. And even given the names down below in red from Danny Young all the way down to Brazaban, the depth in what's going to be available to Carlos Mendoza and David Stearns in AAA is also just fantastic should there be any unexpected or unforeseen injuries. But now we get into the interesting conversation about the bench. Is Starling Marte going to be here? I think he is. Simply due to the fact that the Mets probably want to offload Starling Marte as much as possible. There's no suitors that are giving the value that David Stearns wants. That's quite simple, and that's a fact. Or else he would have already been dealt already. We know that from all the reports from Will Salmon, John Heyman, etc. Starling Marte is going to be here. I have no doubt in my mind about it. Tyrone Taylor had a fantastic season. He kind of got plugged into a role that really wasn't a fit for him. He wasn't ever meant to come here as an everyday starter, but he did a beautiful job in doing that and taking over the services of Harrison Bader somewhere maybe mid-season. So he is a awesome option and probably will be the 4th or 5th outfield option that David Stearns brought him in here to be, especially with that contract flexibility. Luis Torrens also was a steal of a deal mid-season from the Yankees. Given what the value you gave up for him, he's going to be Francisco Alvarez's backup, catcher. Francisco Alvarez, by the way, needs to have a huge season. I think that this lineup can be taken to a next level with the resurgence of obviously Brandon Nimmo and Jeff McNeil, but they're the veterans. They need to have bounce back, seasons, and I'm confident in that. Maybe not so much Jeff McNeil, but we'll see. The jury is still out on Jeff McNeil. But again, Francisco Alvarez, this guy, he wants a contract extension, right? He wants a contract extension sooner rather than later. So let's see it. He's got a new swing. He clearly worked with JD Martinez in a large portion of last season, and he's going to be a new look Francisco Alvarez at the plate in terms of the mechanics. So I just wanted to point that out. Wherever you bat Francisco Alvarez, you can maybe even make the case of putting him below Jesse Winker to have a left-right-left combination. That makes complete sense, but he's going to need to have a huge season. What happens with this last Mets bench roster spot? This is the talk of the town. This is the talk of the second base duel that we're going to be seeing here in spring training between Jeff McNeil and Luis Angel Acuna. Carlos Mendoza and David Stearns have been very adamant that Luis Angel Acuna has the ability to win this job out of spring training. Do I believe that 100%? I have my reservations about that, if that's actually the case, because I just don't see a world where they give him that spot as much as I think he deserves it if he wins the job out of spring training over the veteran Jeff McNeil. I think Jeff McNeil essentially has that job under wraps until maybe a month or a month and a half in. If he doesn't perform, then Luis Angel Acuna goes in there and takes over that role. But are the Mets going to commit to Luis Angel Acuna if Jeff McNeil is the everyday starter at second base? Are they going to commit to him as a utility player? There was a question proposed to David Stearns just a couple of days ago asking this very scenario, this very question. If Jeff McNeil wins the starting second base job, will you put Luis Angel Acuna on the roster as a utility player? Or will you give him everyday reps in AAA, which is a very, very valid question to ask. Because at this point, he's 22 years old. He needs those everyday reps. You can make the argument for that. But then again, I'm not saying that you put him on the roster just because he's a backup shortstop. Who is the backup shortstop at that point if you don't put Luis Angel Acuna on this roster? Jose Iglesias, by the way, is vying for a reunion. He just had a sit-down lunch with John Heyman. It was a New York Post exclusive. Jose Iglesias, Mr. OMG, has multiple offers on the table from different teams around the league, but he still thinks that there's unfinished business with himself and the New York Mets trying to get back to the World Series. Do they make a last-ditch effort to try to retain Jose Iglesias if McNeil's going to win the starting second base job and they want to put Luis Angel Acuna to get everyday reps at AAA? Is Jose Iglesias an option? This last bench spot, I know it's kind of like we're grasping for straws here because it's February 17th. Spring training is ramping up and we need something to talk about, but this is very interesting. What do the cards hold for Jeff McNeil over the next 2 seasons of his contract with the New York Mets? Is he going to be playing out the rest of his contract in Queens with the Mets, or are they going to look to try to trade him at the deadline or maybe next offseason? It's going to be very telling with how he performs over the first 2 months of the season. But ladies and gentlemen, from Francisco Lindor all the way down to Jose Siri, that's my starting 9, so to speak. Those are my 4 bench players. That's 13 positional players on the roster. Kodai Senga all the way down to Paul Blackburn. Clearly, whether it's Jose Quintana, whether it's Dylan Cease or Tyler McGill, those are your options for a 6-man rotation at this point to backfill Frankie Montas' spot. That's what, 19 guys right there. And then you have 7 guys in your bullpen from Edwin Diaz all the way down to make your full 26-man roster. And hopefully I did a fantastic job in selling you all on these predictions because I'm a little bit out of breath. So let me sip my water and let Rob take it away here.
All right, guys. So there we go. When it comes to the lineup and the roster and the bullpen and the rotation and all that for Chris, it's a very good roster, right? I think anyway, if you agree with Chris's or mine's or you have your own, there's not many open availabilities here, and that's where I think that we're having a lot of fun with this. But when it comes to what Chris was saying in regards to, right, he's on board now with 100. It seems like 100% with Dylan C. So let's get it done. I'm after the show, I'll call David Stearns. I'll let him know, like, hey, like, do you need to have a drink? I'll buy you some whiskey, whatever you want. Let's make it happen. But we'll see how that goes. But here is my roster to open up the 2025 season. And we're going to start with the lineup, guys. We know Francisco Lindor. I think he's going to be in a leadoff spot. And it's just what I feel is the most comfortable, what he did last year, MVP caliber. You got to keep him there. I'm still sticking with Juan Soto, number 2, because I just feel like that's where he's going to be. I just feel like that. I'm putting Pete Alonso 3rd, right? He still gets Pete Alonso to be behind him, what he wants, no matter if he's 3 or 3 and Alonso's 4. It doesn't matter. Pete Alonso's 3rd. Mark Vientos is batting cleanup. Brandon Nimmo, I like in the 5th spot. For some reason, I think Brandon Nimmo is just going to, like Chris said, I think he can. You don't have to be great. He, bat 270. You can knock in 85 to 90 RBIs. You get 20 home runs from him, and that's exactly what you can get from the 5th starter. And again, what Chris said about Francisco Alvarez, 110% is the key, I think, to the bottom of this order. I think at some point, I think Alvarez is going to skip over Brandon Nimmo. I think Alvarez is going to have a bounce back season. I just feel like he seems confident in himself that he's fixed, or he's trying to fix what his problem was last year. And I think we're going to see that from him in 2025. So I got Alvarez in the sixth spot. And then it's hard to go with Jesse Winker or Jeff McNeil. I think you can flip Alvarez too. I think there's a lot of ways to go about it, but I think the Jesse Winker, Jeff McNeil, Jose Siri, 7, 8, and 9, I think is where I go, because you kind of get the lefty righty over there. And besides the Winker and McNeil, that's both lefties, depending on if Marte's playing, you're still going to have that lefty-righty matchup. And I just like the fact that the bottom of the order, you actually have power there, right? You got power in front of McNeil. You got a power in front of Jose Siri. You're not going to see a lot of, average from these guys, but they can knock the ball over the wall. And that's something the Mets didn't have at the bottom of the order last year. And I think it's key, because Winker can hit 15, 16 home runs. We know Jose Siri is a 20 home run guy. And if McNeil can get back to that, even 280 at the bottom of the order, that is a threat now for at the bottom of the order to not only turn your lineup over to the top of the order, but you have power where one swing in a bat can knock you 2 runs. And I think this is where the bottom of the order, and we kind of agree at the bottom of the order where these guys are going to be, depending on if you want Jeff McNeil as a starter or not. We do believe that Jeff McNeil is going to be a starter, including myself. And when it comes to the rotation, obviously throw Frankie Montas out of there. Again, there's so many different options at the moment because of the internal options that we have. I don't think it's going to be Brandon Sproul, as me and Chris just talked about earlier. I don't think the Mets are going to throw, unless there's another major injury where the Mets really don't have no choice. You might see Brandon Sproul as like a desperate attempt to throw him out there and pray for the best. I still believe Griffin Cannon is going to be the depth in would have been the depth in the rotation, but because of the injury with Montas, I think you're throwing in Tyler McGill and Griffin Cannon in this rotation. I think Sean Manaea is going to be the ace of staff. I think he's getting the opening day start. I know Chris at Kodai Senga. I don't know how true to form but I know we did talk about it on the hot stove that he believes Kodai Senga is probably going to get day one on opening day. But I'm going to go with Sean Manaea with Senga right behind him. Peterson, the 3 spot. I think you're going to have to move everybody up. Clay Holmes is going to be your 4th starter. Tyler McGill, Griffin Cannon, pick your poison at the 5th or 6th spot. I don't really care. I don't think they're going to show much this year anyway. I'm sick of Tyler McGill. But again, Tyler McGill somehow, some way, always finds a spot in his rotation, regardless of if the Mets are done with him or not. If it's injuries, if it's, whatever it might be, Tyler McGill finds a way to have 2 opening day starts in his career already, when most guys really don't. And now he's probably going to get jumped into this rotation just because of circumstance. So Tyler McGill, Griffin Cannon, welcome to the New York Mets. You're thrown into the rotation, at least until this point. Maybe Quintana will be here. Maybe it will be a cease trade, or a trade that we don't even think of as of yet to bring in another arm in regards to the rotation right now. When it comes to the bullpen guys, again, it's almost status quo until you get to the bottom here. And again, there's no wrong answer here, right? Chris had Griffin Cannon there. If that stays the course, and maybe they go elsewhere with the rotation arm. But I'm going to go with Sean Reed-Foley at the bottom. I think the Mets really do like him. He pitched really well before he got hurt last year. If he stays healthy, I think he'd be a good addition to this bullpen. He's got a live arm. He's a badass on the mound. He got the balls. He's not afraid to go after hitters. If he can stay healthy, I think he's going to get the nod over Brazaban, over either Young Cabrera or even Max Kranick, who I think the Mets probably either want him either in a bullpen or as a starting role as very much emergency depth if it happens. But when it comes to the bullpen guys, I love this bullpen. Chris even brought it up earlier. The lineup and the bullpen on paper should do the job that we're expecting them to do, and should be top 3 in the league. The lineup offensively and the bullpen pitching wise. The rotation is the question mark with this team. And, more and more people are starting to lean to that Dylan Cease, bandbox now, and trying to jump on the bandwagon with Dylan Cease because of the fact you don't want this starting rotation losing us games when you have a bullpen like you do on paper and a lineup that you have on paper that can be top 3, top 5 in the league, and you're going to lose games because the rotation isn't as good. I don't think David Stearns is going to let that happen. He can talk all he wants about the confidence level in this rotation, but actions speak louder than words. He went after Garrett Crochet. He tried to get him. He was in talks with the Padres, if not still in talks with the Padres in regards to Dylan Cease. If you love and have confidence in that rotation you put together, you're not going after those guys to give up prospects if you have full confidence in that rotation. So this bullpen and this lineup, I love. I really think they're going to be the crucial parts of this team, but you don't want 1/3 of your team being the major reason why you're losing ball games, right? Last year, it was the lineup that was a problem when the rotation and the bullpen were doing their job early on, and then it took the lineup taking over when the rotation was struggling, other than Manaea, and then the pitching was a little bit better with rotation-wise, but the bullpen was a disaster. So one thing, 1 out of the 3 can cause major losses here during the season, and the rotation scares the hell out of me. But there is potential to be good here. I think Clay Holmes is going to surprise us. As much as people, we know that he hasn't pitched as a starter since Pittsburgh. I think Clay Holmes is going to surprise people. I'm not saying he's going to go to a 2.5 ERA, but I think anything better than lower than a 4, I think is excellent. And who knows? He could be the next Michael King. He could be the next Seth Lugo, hopefully. If not, just be serviceable, and you're in the back end of the rotation, and it could be better than what we had last year at the back end of the rotation. Now getting to the bench. Starlin Marte, I think, is still going to be here, just like Chris said. I find it hard to believe unless they package him in a bigger deal or add a prospect to that, which I don't think the Mets want to do. Marte is going to be a part of this team, either as somewhere in the outfield utility guy, and obviously platooning with Winker at DH. Tyrone Taylor is what he is. He's a multi-use guy in the outfield. He can play all 3 outfield positions. He took over the Bader job in center field because he was hitting better than Tyrone Taylor. Tyrone Taylor is an excellent guy to have on your bench, and we know he can start if any worst-case scenario happens to any of our 3 outfielders that will be starting in 2025. Luis Torrens, he was a revelation when we got him from the Yankees last year. He's going to help Alvarez as much as possible. And when he gets one or 2 starts a week as a backup catcher, we know he's going to be serviceable. Maybe not with the bat, but we know we can gun guys out at any bag. And he's one of the better catchers defensively in baseball when it just comes to what we've seen him do. And last but not least, I think Nick Madrigal is going to make this team. David Stearns doesn't get you in here and kind of took him over Jose Iglesias at this point. Even if the Mets bring back Jose Iglesias, guess who's not going to be on this roster? And that's Luisangel Acuna. They're not going to sit Luisangel Acuna on the bench by any means and not get him at bats on a consistent basis. The only way I can see that, as we talked about earlier, if they find a way to get Marte off this roster, that's an extra roster spot for an infielder. And then you could put Acuna in there. You can DH him when there's a lefty on the mound. You can give Lindor a day off, give McNeil a day off. And you can probably start him 3 times a week, maybe 4, and get enough at bats where it's obvious that you can keep him there and still get him as at bats. I don't think there's much of a chance unless McNeil looks like a complete disaster in spring and Luisangel Acuna just lights it up in spring training. I truly believe that Luisangel Acuna is going to start in AAA. Now, doesn't mean he won't be here in May. I said this from the start. I think Jeff McNeil is going to win the job, and he's going to get a month. If he struggles, you're going to see a Mark Vientos Beatty swap. I think it's going to be very similar to that. And McNeil's going to sit his ass on the bench and play scarcely. And that's his job to lose at this point. And I think that's where we are when it comes to the bench right now. But I think Madrigal is going to make this team. Now, it will be interesting if the Mets do find a way to sign Jose Iglesias. He's clearly going to take one of those spots on the bench. And we'll see how that configures when we, if that does happen. But I still don't think a major trade is going to happen. As much as I want to have Dylan Cease on the Mets, and it should be possible at this point, right? You're 1 injury in the rotation away from it already being a disaster, and it's not March yet. And I'm not saying it's going to happen, but again, we didn't even know Montas wasn't even throwing, right? They said he wasn't throwing for a while. So they knew about this injury. What I hope is that they didn't know about this injury before they signed him, because they did give him a physical. And I'll bring up Chris in a little bit after I finish about this situation with Montas. But you know what? Screw it. Let's just do it right now, because Chris, I want to get back to you when it comes to this situation. Excuse me. When it comes to the overall situation where Montas, they said he wasn't throwing for a while. And again, we signed Montas right before the winter meetings. It was very early in the offseason. But they said he wasn't throwing for a while, right? He had an injury 2 years ago in 2023 with the Yankees after he got traded there. And there was some concern about his velocity last year. And they said he wasn't throwing for a while. What do you think that means? Like, was that like December? Like, if they signed him to a 2-year deal, knowing that there was an issue with his lat or something was going on, and you sign him to a 2-year, $34 million deal when Bueller was there and other guys that could have easily stepped into this rotation and helped you. Not saying that they wouldn't get hurt, but what are your thoughts on that whole situation with Montas, where they said he hasn't thrown in a while? So they knew this for a decent amount of time.
I mean, the only thing at that point, I mean, you're not going to sign a guy that has, carries a huge injury risk. He did post 150 innings collectively last season, and we know that the 2023 and 2022 campaigns for him were just injury riddled, right? So he was on track to start getting right again, right? Because again, he posted less than, I think, 75 to 80 innings both in 2022 and 2023. I know one of those seasons for sure. Someone can fact check me if it's the second one as well, but definitely under 100, I think, for both. And then 150 in 2024. There's no chance they take, given the way that they wanted to build this rotation, there's no way they take a chance on knowing that there's a predisposed injury concern with him. I think that if they knew he wasn't throwing for a little bit, it was just preventative. And that's all that it was at the time of the signing. I do know that he reported to spring training right away, and we've all seen on our social media accounts him throwing in the outfield,
Yeah.
warming up, him throwing bullpen sessions alongside some of the other guys like Clay Holmes. So he did ramp up and did start throwing bullpens. I don't know when this injury happened. Again, it blindsided me. I'm sure it blindsided the Mets. I honestly didn't hear what you just said. I didn't hear that before coming onto the team, that he didn't throw for a little bit this offseason. So that's a little bit shocking to me. But with what he did last season collectively in 2024 in those 150 innings, even appearing in, I believe, the wild card series as
Yeah.
well against the Mets at some point, nothing at that point, I would have to assume, again, just speculation, but nothing at that point at the time of the signing was probably stated in terms of, watch out. This is a huge red flag with Frankie Montas, other than what he did in 2022 and 2023, which was just pitch not many innings due to a lot of injuries. So I don't know. Did you see the innings on Montas for 22 and 23?
It was like 140 something, if I'm not
Let me
mistaken.
check.
And I know he had about 150 something innings last year. Again, that's fine and all. He would have had easily 170 plus innings if he stayed healthy with the Yankees in 2023. But yeah, so I think he would have been okay innings wise. But he is a 160 to 170 inning guy, and that's the problem. And again, I'm not blaming the Mets here, right? Again, anybody get injured at any time. I mean, you could have signed Burns and he got hurt, or Freed. You just don't know. But again, when you try to get quantity over quality, these are the issues you fall into, because you're replacing a guy that is not that much better, if worse, in this rotation as well. And it is frustrating. Again, I'm not saying the Mets knew about this injury and we're hoping for the best. That's just a stupid way to go about it. But again, I'm not saying you completely bargain basement shopping, but when you're going for the tier B, tier C guys, you're hoping for the best along with these guys staying healthy. And most of these guys have injury concerns, right? Montas has been hurt over the last 2 seasons, and you're hoping for the best. With Luis Severino, when we picked him up and signed him, he basically had a full season the year before. He just sucked, right? So it's a huge difference. And I do wonder, what is the thought process here? Again, this is where the pitching lab is kind of, silly at some points because it can't keep a pitcher healthy. And, it's not making Griffin Cannon and a number three starter. I just don't see that. Can the pitching line make Tyler McGill middle of the rotation guy that can stay there and pitch well? I don't know. Like it might fix one or two guys, but I think we're overblown in with the pitching lab, and I think they're falling for the pitching lab to be the saving grace here, in my opinion.
Yeah, so he did throw. I checked as well. You were right. 144 innings in 2022, and then in 2023, he was out for the large majority, I believe, as a New York Yankee. If I'm not mistaken. Um, but I honestly, personally, I'm not gonna lie. I know that Frankie Montas hasn't really been impressive since his Oakland Athletics days. I know that he showed some flashes last season. I think the valuation of that signing to be a starting pitcher for, which is effectively what the Mets brought Sevy to be before Kodai Senga went down with an injury last season as well at the time of the signing. I can't really fault them for it. I mean, it's a starting pitcher for. You're not really asking the world out of Montas at that point. You're really just asking him for those innings. Like you said, if he pitches to the tune of like a 3.75 to 4 ERA, you're going to take that all day long. But I don't know, man. At this point, he's on the shelf for at least 6 to 8 weeks, not throwing. He's going to have to ramp up, and it's next man up at that point. And it's just unfortunate. It's an unfortunate situation. And I think that the perfect remedy at that point would just go on the safe side. Bring in a guy like Jose Quintana. I think we can all agree that we don't think the Mets are going to make the move for Dylan Cease as much as we would like for it to happen. So bring back the veteran. Jose Quintana is also going to give you a lot of innings, right? I mean, he doesn't really carry much injury risk as well, if I'm not mistaken. So he was a reliable pitcher for you. Why not run it back? As much as I wanted to run this guy out of town last season before he picked it up, I'm all in favor for Jose Quintana at this point as the most realistic option, right? Not the best option, the most realistic option. A couple of other notes that I wanted to talk about. We're doing perfect on timing here, just about an hour. Not going to keep you all too long tonight to enjoy the rest of your Monday night. But we were talking about in the chat here when I was a little bit on the minimized screen about some of the options, and it made sense for you to put Sean Reed Foley into that mix because he doesn't have any options left remaining. So he is, a potential candidate to make this bullpen for the upside that he possesses. If an injury happens, then you're talking about potentially DFA, IL stint, etc. But losing out on his production, you'd have to probably DFA him at that point. And if he clears waivers, then you can bring him back, but he's not going to clear waivers at that point. I mean, he's a bulldog, like you said. Other teams are definitely going to catch wind of that. Brazabana has two options. Danny Young has no options either, so maybe they try to sneak him onto the roster without potentially losing him. Who else has options? I think Kranik has options. What was the other bullpen guy that I was talking about?
It wasn't
Henderson Cabrera.
Henderson
Yeah,
Cabrera,
I
right?
know.
It was somebody
Yeah,
else.
he's a non-roster invitee, so I'm still
Yeah,
struggling to
yeah,
figure
yeah,
out how that works. So I don't know. But anyways, the fact of the matter is that I like that Brazabon has two options. I was a little bit surprised there when I looked at Fangraphs, but the bullpen is in good shape. Like we said in both of our predictions, this rotation, man, like what's gonna happen? It's just kind of like a deep sigh for me now. It's just like, we have the names to plug in. We
You you,
do.
you think
We don't like the options.
I mean, because I know you were okay with this rotation, prior to the injury with Montas. You thought Montas was going to be better than probably most people thought, but you,
Yeah.
you feel like the rotation, even if say Montas was healthy, you think they would have been fine. But without Montas, now you're more concerned.
Yes, correct. That's exactly
Okay,
what I'm saying. I
okay,
think this rotation was serviceable. I think Clay Holmes is going to have a hell of a season. I did a video on his projections. Not that projections mean anything at the end of the day, it's just projections. But we've seen consistently so many successful stories Reynaldo Lopez, Seth Lugo, Michael King of these guys having an easy time transitioning over. And if you have a six-man rotation, you're not going to really need him to go 180, 190. And even if you do, at a certain point in year one of Clay Holmes going back into the rotation, I think they have a set limit of innings for him. So let's
sure.
say he reaches 150 to 160. At that point, they're probably going to be like, okay, now you move over to the bullpen to get him less regular appearances. And then they can transition him back maybe into more of a 180, 190 inning guy in year two. I don't have any worries about Clay Holmes. I think Montas was clearly going to have an uphill battle to maintain respectable numbers, but I still think that with what we've seen in the second half of last season, primarily, I think that the six-man rotation with Montas in it was serviceable enough to see and get the Mets to a point at a successful point at the deadline to then wheel and deal for moves. But I knew in the back of my mind that there wasn't really much room for error. There is, but there isn't, because, like you said, it's quantity over quality. And I've been very adamant, even in my support of the rotation and my willingness to accept that rotation with Montas in it before he went down with the injury. I knew that if there was any injury to that rotation, we were going to be talking about immediately a guy like Griffin Canning filling in or a guy like Tyler McGill. And at that point, I can't get on board with that. I need better options at that point. But I do think I agree with you. I think Paul Blackburn 100% is going to be in this rotation. I think he was going to be in this rotation regardless as that sixth starter, even if Montas was, in the equation before the injury. But now he's for sure going to be there. And then you're probably talking about the familiar face in Tyler McGill, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean that's the unfortunate thing. And again, I'm on record stating that I don't like this rotation. I think there's way too many question marks. Even if you believe Minaya is going to be close to what he was last year, and you know what, I would agree. I think he's going to be fine. Even if he isn't what he was last year, I would think he'd be close to that. There's way too many question marks. There's already protection with Kodai Senga when it comes to innings. They need to do the six-man rotation because of him. Can he stay healthy? Now it looks like he can be healthy, but again, could it be a freak injury? What hurt him the second time was a freak injury. Getting off the mound and stepping the wrong way, messed up his calf, and he was basically out until the playoffs. Again, I did. Clay Holmes, we know he has the stuff, right? But has he pitched more than 75 innings since he was a starter in Pittsburgh? No. And again, this is the issue, right? When we get to that point where, what if we need Clay Holmes is one of our better starters in August, late August. You're not going to throw him in the bullpen to save his innings. You might need him as a starter. And now you're going into the unforbidden innings limit. And now you have to use him more because you need to win those games. And then it's like deja vu all over again in the playoffs. You hope these guys, have any juice left in the tank to get through a playoff run if you get there. That's why I don't like this whole concept of, quantity over quality, because yes, they might look good during the season. They might help you get into the playoffs, but when you get there, is the gas tank on empty? Like that's what I were worried about, and we talked about it last year with the rotation we had. And I know it was unforeseen circumstances because their plan was probably to bring up a lot of the young kids, probably trade off a couple of guys, and not caring about the innings limits when they can control it, because they didn't think they could be a playoff team, even though they said it. We all know the situation that could have happened. But when things actually were starting to work out and they were going on that run, they needed every one of those guys, and their innings were well past probably what they wanted anybody to go past. But when you're in the hunt, you got to do what you got to do. And this is the situation where you have the lineup, you have the bullpen, right? Why lessen your rotation to use your bullpen more, which you're probably going to use definitely a lot in the first half to protect their innings? So that means the bullpen is going to be overused regardless in the first half, even if the rotation is solid. You're not throwing them a lot of innings, so you're going to use a lot of your bullpen in the first half. Now you hope that your bullpen can hang on for dear life in the second half, and they might even burn out. I think that's a losing battle sometimes. And again, maybe David Stearns will surprise us trading for a pitcher. Even if it's not Dylan Cease, somebody in the middle of the rotation that is a solid pitcher, and I'd be okay with that. But, we're talking about a deadline. I know people were bringing up in the chat about the deadline. It's the same concept, right? Why not get Dylan Cease now for 30 starts instead of, what are you going to save? One prospect, possibly, maybe even not, just to get him for 15 starts? It's just the concept doesn't make any sense to me. And again, a lot of things can happen, but we're one injury away to having a very much a complete disaster going into into spring training or even into opening day, and that's something that we shouldn't be dealing with.
That would be really bad. That I
Yeah.
agree with you 100%. I'm going to say this on record right now. With the name still available and maybe with the Mets' lack of committing towards a trade, yeah, there could be a trade for a lesser starter, like you said, a mid rotation type of guy. I think the writing's on the wall. I think Jose Quintana is coming back. I think he's coming back.
I'm
It
okay
makes
with
too much
that.
sense.
Yeah,
Makes too much sense.
I'm okay with that, but it still brings up the same concept, right? Right. At some point, you're going to need another starter that is worth getting at the like unless somebody steps up. Like if Clay Holmes becomes even still, if Clay Holmes looks like King or Lugo, and you're going to need him a lot more, he's going well over his innings that he's ever pitched in his almost entire career, and that's where you're going to have a concern. But again, there's still a lot of spring training to go. I still think David Stearns is going to make a trade here. I'd be shocked if he doesn't. I think he's going to bring in another pitcher. Internally, doesn't he can't excite anybody. If David Stearns is
No,
excited about
yeah.
internal options, right? I mean, you gotta drug test them because there's something going on here. And again, you don't go after Garrett Crochet, and you don't have talks with the Padres with Dylan Cease if you're that confident in your rotation as a whole and your depth. You just don't do that. So, he's talking, on both sides of his ass here when it comes to this rotation. I don't
So who do
believe,
they trade for? Who do they trade for? If because you said you don't think it's going to be Dylan Cease. I don't think it's going to be Dylan Cease either. So who do they bring in?
geez, I don't know. um,
Jordan Montgomery?
I don't think Arizona's going to do that. Uh, I think, oh man, I don't know. You know what? I would have to look at rosters and see, somebody that might be a little desperate here and they might need something that we have. But oh man, you know what? I think I'm gonna say Dylan Cease. I feel like he's just gonna get forced to do it. Not like overpay or anything like that, because I think David Stearns is smarter than that. But I truly think that there is a way to get Dylan Cease here without Brandon Sproat being an option. Yeah, it might be Luis Angel Acuna, but again, it's not the end of the world, guys. Luis Angel Acuna is not his brother and probably never be his brother. And I'm not saying, that's what we're expecting him to be. But when you have almost a complete team, this is the time to have your surplus of middle infielders that we talked about for a couple of years now, that we just have too many middle infielders. At some point, they got to become assets. Choose the ones you believe are going to help your team now and in the future, and use the other assets as trade to bring in proven guys to help this team, right? You can help your roster tremendously with Dylan C, especially in a contract year. He's trying to have a great season, and he might benefit from that. Even though you might have him only as a rental and the Mets might not sign him after this year, it's worth the risk. It really is. So I think it's still going to be Dylan Cease, even though I don't believe it. I think at some point, I think David Stearns is going to realize that Jose Quintana is probably not going to cut it if you bring him in. Griffin Cannon and Tyler McGill is not, they might look good in spring, but we all know what they're going to be. They're going to be a 4.5 ERA guy, and that's about it. I think it's going to happen. I really think it's going to happen.
I will say this. I think it's more likely for the Mets to do a deal with the Mariners than they are with the Padres. Just historically speaking, in terms of the lack of trades between. First of all, AJ Preller is just a tough-minded individual when it comes to Mets front
Right.
office, or not Mets front office, but Padres front office baseball. And then David Stearns is as well for the Mets, respectively. So that's like an ongoing battle within itself. I think the Mariners, with what they need offensively, it just makes sense. And I'm not saying it's like Luis Castillo clear cut. They have a lot of pitching that they can, depart with and still be okay, but they need offensive upgrades in certain positions. So at that point, you're probably talking about a Jeff McNeil plus also prospects, because again, they're not going to want to pay Jeff McNeil, and Jeff McNeil alone, right? there's too much unprovenness with him, if that's even a word, because you don't know how he's going to bounce back. He had a little bit of a spurt last season in the second half, but I think that a deal, if a trade happens, I think Quintana is just a clear cut easiest answer here.
Yeah.
I that's where I'll think I'll stick with that because I already said that. But I think that if you're giving me a choice of which route the Mets would be more likely to take, doing a deal with the Mariners or the Padres, I think it would be the Seattle Mariners, to be
Ooh,
honest.
you get me excited with Luis Castillo all over again. It seems like early offseason talk again. I like it. But
I'm not saying Castillo strictly. I'm just saying any deal for
yeah,
a Mariners pitcher.
no, yeah, I get it. And look, it is what it is, right? You can't predict injuries, and you just have to go with that next man mentality, like you said, Chris. And we'll see, right? The Mets are getting tested on February 17th when full workouts are going to be starting tomorrow for the team. So again, it is what it is, right? David Stearns brought in depth. Well, it's already getting tested. We'll see how it goes, guys. And I want to thank you guys for checking out our roster predictions for 2025. You can agree to disagree. And if you missed it, just go back and replay it and see our roster predictions. And we talked about Montas, we talked about Marte, we talked about Alonso. And of course, we will see you in our individual shows over the next couple of weeks or so, but we are going to have a season preview later in March. Obviously, that's like a month and a half, about a month or so away before the season starts. And of course, the amazing Mets pregame show and the Mets postgame show we'll be doing when the season starts. So with that said, guys, I want to thank you guys for watching. Enjoy the show from now on in the future. Hopefully you like our predictions. If you don't, too bad. No, I'm joking. Chris, final words, and have a great night, man.
No, this was a great stream. I love doing this. There's so many, there's so many options. There's so many different routes the Mets can take, and it's going to depend on the competitions that we're going to see in spring training. This is why it's so fun. And it's spring training at the end of the day. It doesn't count towards the win-loss record, but it's so fun because you get to see these battles internally. These guys are all part of the same organization, but they're battling. Some of the guys are battling for that last roster spot, respectively, on any given positional allocation for the team. So all I want to say is that thank you all so much for continuously rocking with us and supporting us. It means the world. Check out all the latest content on both of our channels. If you missed any of the videos that I've been posting over the past week, the link's going to be in the description down below. If you haven't subscribed yet to my channel, make sure to smash that subscribe button. I'm just about, 21 subscribers away from 2.3K. I appreciate you all. It means a lot. Again, have a great rest of your Monday. And we'll see you all on the future video or stream. Peace.
There you go, guys. Let's go Mets. We'll see you next time, guys. Have a great night.